Hello everyone, it's Karen at the Cool Tool Studio. I'm here today to offer an introduction to soldering. Soldering is a wonderful skill for any maker to pick up, but I think it's going to be especially helpful for those of you who are metal clay artists. It offers opportunity for post-firing fabrication and opens a lot of creative doors. So today I'm going to be covering generally what is soldering, some different soldering schemes you can execute, and the materials that you'll need to solder. So I figured we'd just start off by talking about soldering generally and just how it works. So solder is an alloy that has a lower melting temp than the parent metals or the metals to be joined. As the metal to be joined is heated, the metal particles expand some and create microscopic spaces within the structure of the metal. Solder is then introduced at this time, and because it has a lower melting temperature and is fluid, the solder is drawn into the parent metals by capillary action, effectively connecting the metals and creating a very strong connection. In order for soldering to work, the pieces to be soldered together must fit very tightly, and both the metal and the solder must be clean. Flux is used alongside solder to facilitate the solder flowing, and depending on what metal you are soldering, sometimes prevent the metal from forming oxides while it's heating. So we're going to start off by talking about the different types of solders that is available to you and why you might choose one over another. Soldering sheet, chip, and wire are basically the same thing, just in a different form. Solder sheet is solder that has been milled into a sheet, and then you would use something like tin snips to cut it to the desired shape and size. Then these little solder chips, it's just basically this already cut up for you. So it's just a little more convenient. And then solder wire is solder wire. It's solder that's been drawn into a wire form. And this is really convenient because you can just cut it with wire cutters. And also, if you're doing a very large piece, sometimes people will just hold the solder in a third hand or some tweezers and tap it to their piece and solder without even cutting it. But basically, all three of these work the same way, they're just in different forms. Another solder option that's available to you is soldering paste. Soldering paste is really helpful if you're doing a sweat solder and something where you're sandwiching two pieces and soldering them together in that way. It's helpful for that because you can just apply it to the one piece and place it on top. Soldering paste contains flux within it, so you don't have to use flux when you're using this material. All of these different types of solder come in different grades or melting temperatures. There's hard, medium, and easy. And in some cases, you'll also be working with extra easy if you choose to bring that on as well. But they have different melting temperatures. So when you're going to be tackling a solder job, it's very important that you plan it all out and you know how many solder joints you're going to have. For example, if I was planning on setting a stone in a simple piece like this, I would know that I have to have one solder job where I closed my bezel, and then another solder job where I joined my bezel to my back plate here. So in this instance, I would want to use hard, or the solder with a higher melting temp, prior to using a solder with a lower melting temperature. That way I don't run the risk of reopening this seam when I'm joining the bezel to my back plate. So you always start off with hard, and then depending on how many joints you have, work your way down to medium and easy. Something to keep in mind is that hard solder is the closest to the parent metal of silver here, and as you work your way down to easy and potentially extra easy, those are more heavily alloyed and have the lower melting temperature metals introduced in them. So there'll be a slightly less accurate color match as you go. So hard solder will look the most similar to your silver, and if you use extra easy solder, you might notice that you can kind of see some of your seams a little more visibly. While we're talking about solder, another thing to pay attention to is that your solder may tarnish as it sits. So these are fresh and new. This is some wire that I've had sitting around in my studio, and you can see that it's a little bit darker. And that would actually make it so my solder would not want to flow while I'm soldering. So prior to conducting any soldering jobs, it just helps to set yourself up for success by hitting them with a polishing pad, a Scotch-Brite, whatever you have handy to just really quick clean up that surface and make sure that your solder is clean and ready to go. Here are some of the tools that you need to get started in soldering. I have an annealing pan, which is essentially a fireproof environment for me to be soldering in, but annealing pans are also helpful because they spin and rotate, and that can be handy while you're soldering. I also have some soldering bricks And I like to have two. I like to keep my solder on one of them and then my pieces itself. That way if I accidentally forget to clean up the solder off my workspace when I'm done, I'm not going to set another piece on it, heat it, and then get solder where I don't want to have it. I also have here some cross-lock tweezers or a third hand, a soldering pick, and some tweezers that are dedicated to soldering. I have a brush for applying my flux and some flux. And then I've got some safety glasses, a fume extractor. I also have a small handheld butane torch, and these are just really convenient because you can buy the fuel for them at any sort of hardware store. I also have a mask and then some sort of dish with water for quenching your pieces into. If you are just getting started in soldering and you need to be purchasing any of these tools, there is a link posted in the description below this video. Before we dive on in, I'm going to take a moment to talk about safety. You should always pull back any long hair and make sure that your sleeves are tight and close fitting. You should be wearing safety glasses and then either be working in a very well ventilated environment or make sure that you're using a fume extractor and a respirator mask. I also think it's important to make sure that your environment is safe for soldering, and I think that's going to give you some confidence and help your soldering go successfully. So at home, I'm not wanting to worry about setting my wall on fire or anything extra and exciting like that. So I set up a safe environment, and I did that at home by taking these large ceramic tiles and I set them on both my work surface and then prop them against the wall as well. Check your environment for anything flammable and make sure that it's just a safe place to be soldering. Additionally, you should always have a fire extinguisher close by. And I think just going through this checklist will set you up with confidence to solder. So I'm going to start off by covering sweat soldering, and that is when there is a flat face that you're joining to a flat face. Another way to set yourself up for success when you're soldering, and I'm going to point out now, is that especially if you're working with metal clay, you want your metal to be shiny and high polished. So I went ahead and burnished the backside of this piece and the face of the piece that I'm going to be joining together. And I'm going to be showing you how to use traditional solder in chip form, and then how to use paste solder on this piece. And then on this piece, I'm going to demonstrate how you can charge one piece and then place it and do a sweat solder connection for something like a tie tack or an earring. So I'm starting off with some flux. And again, this facilitates solder flow and prevents the buildup of oxides. And I'm putting it on both of my pieces to be joined. And when you are doing sweat soldering, you want to place your solder or charge with solder the smaller of your two pieces. So I'm going to apply the solder to this piece and then reflow it on this piece. If I were to put it on this piece, it would just kind of spread and potentially expand past the edge of my piece and could look messy. So I'm going to start off by heating the smaller of the two elements. So we're going to sneak to the middle of my board here. And I like working with this paste flux because it kind of turns clear. It gets white and then it clears out. And that's an indicator that this metal is getting close to a temperature for soldering, but it's also going to be tacky at this point, and that kind of helps the solder stick. And there's two different ways you can be placing your solder for this. You can pick up the solder with your tweezers and place it to apply it to this piece. Or you could do a little bit of pick soldering, which is where you heat your solder itself and pick up a piece and then place. So however you want to go about it, you want to charge the smaller of your two pieces with solder. So at this point, I'm just heating the small piece and looking for the solder to flash and flow. There it went. You can see it's flat, it's spread, and then at this point, you're able to pick it up and place. If you're having to do a really precise placement, you can quench it at this point and use your hands, but I'm just going to go ahead and use tweezers and place it hot. And now, In order for solder to flow and successfully join two pieces, both of the pieces have to meet the same temperature at the same time. So if I'm overheating this top piece and I'm not really focusing my heat on my back piece, it's just going to keep flowing on that top face. So since this back piece is larger, I'm going to start off by focusing my heat on that, and knowing that I already heated this top piece a little bit, I'm going to every once in a while come over and heat that top piece as well, but I'm just really focusing my heat on this back piece here. So the flux underneath there is kind of going, so I'm going to use my pick to kind of push down and do some adjustment in my placement. Like I said, I'm focusing my heat on this back piece because it's larger and it hasn't yet been heated. And I'm just kind of looking to see, you should be able to see a flash along the side of your piece when the solder beneath has flowed. And you can kind of see there's that nice border along my piece as well, where the flux is keeping the oxides from building up. And that solder has flowed. Something I feel like I should be pointing out is, it's kind of hard to see right now, but on my torch there's this inner blue cone, and that is the hottest point of my flame. So when you are heating something, you want to be using the inner blue cone of your torch. About like a 1/4 inch or so in front of it is where you'll be applying your heat. So there's the traditional method of applying solder, and we're going to move on by covering paste. I'm just going to come over here and quench. So again, paste is convenient for something like this because you don't have to heat twice. You can just apply the paste, place your pieces, and heat everything at once. Technically, the paste does contain flux, but since I've got this broad area back here, I'm going to go ahead and apply some flux to my back plate. So for this, I've got my solder paste, and I'm just going to apply it to my smaller elements. That should be plenty. And then because when this paste flux does flow, it kind of settles and moves, I'm going to heat it up a little bit to give myself some tackiness before I place those smaller elements. And again, I'm heating and looking for clear. And these are just some little pieces that I've made with finishing touches. And especially with paste, you can kind of see right now it's smoking and kicking up some fumes. You really want to make sure that you are working in a very well ventilated environment. All right, so again, torch is on. And I'm hoping you can see that inner blue cone again is really where I'm targeting my heat. And especially since these little pieces are so small, I'm really focusing my heat on my back piece here. And I'm eventually going to kind of skim over them a couple of times to heat them too. And I'm looking for just a little bit of a flash along the edges. I'm going to tap them down to make sure they're settled and touching well. Do any adjustments that I might want to do with placement. Turn up my heat a little bit. And sometimes you kind of have to come down at the level with your work to be able to catch that flash. And there you go. All right, so we're going to take this to quench. And then we're going to round out this sweat soldering section with the connection that I probably use most often. I use this type of soldering a lot for adding tie tacks or scatter pins or ear wires to small little pieces like this. And for this one, I'm going to be charging that little tie tack and then just placing it and flashing my heat. So you know the drill by now. Starting with flux, put a little bit on both pieces to be joined, just like always. And then in this case, I got a pair of tweezers handy because I'm going to pick up my post and bring it over to my solder. So I'm heating just a little in there, it's clear, and then I'm bringing it over here and I'm going to heat my solder until it balls up. And then I'm just going to tap to pick it up. And then I'm going to heat my piece itself here, looking for that flux to go clear. And then I'm going to tap in place, and that just immediately flashed and flowed. And there's your solder joint. So again, I use that a lot when I'm adding ear wires to piece. It's just a really straightforward and simple way to solder. So these are my pieces after they've been soldered and quenched, and you can see that there's a bunch of oxides built up, especially on these bronze pieces, from the process of being heated. And what you do to remove that and clean it up after you solder is you place your pieces in something called a pickle. And a pickle is just basically an acid solution that's been heated. Cool Tools sells both the pickle and this really convenient little pickle pot. And you'll be able to tell when they're done. They'll just look clean. And usually, if your pickle is nice and warm, maybe 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how heavily the oxides built up while you were soldering. The next method of soldering that I'm going to be covering is called chip soldering. And that is where little chips of solder are placed and then heated to flow. So this is a really common application for that method, is closing a bezel and then joining a bezel to a back plate. And I'm starting off by applying flux to the inside and outside of my seam. And this is one of those instances where a third hand or a cross-lock tweezer comes in handy. So I'm just going to set it up like that. So when you're working with this paste flux, I like to heat it first and then place my solder because it gets kind of tacky. And then I know my chip isn't going to run off on me. So this bezel wire is really thin, so just as a quick note here, you'll notice that my torch is not at full capacity. I did that with just kind of half my fuel there. And I heated till tacky, and then I'm going to use my tweezers to place my chip. So I've got 2 soldering operations on this job. So I'm going to be starting off with a chip of hard solder to close this bezel here. I'm placing it directly over top my seam. And I'm going to reapply heat. I kind of focus my heat on the back a little bit to start, and then I'll come up. But there it goes, just like that. So that seam is flowed. I'm going to quench it and then solder this bezel onto the back plate, also using chip soldering. I'm going to move this guy over. And these softer bricks are kind of convenient for soldering. If like this piece, for instance, has a little bail on the back, and I can just kind of squish it in and get this surface nice and flat. I'm going to apply my flux, back plate, and to the side of the bezel that I'm going to be applying to the back plate. And then I'm going to get the back plate heated to be sticky and then place my bezel. So this is a larger piece, so I'm going to dial the heat up. And I'm heating my piece as a whole. I'm just giving it a good general heat and looking for that flux to get clear and sticky. So that'll do it. And at this point, I'm going to place both my bezel and my chips of solder. Right, so I'm happy with that placement. And then you want to place your chips as close to your bezel as possible. Since I did that seam to close my bezel with hard, I'm doing this connection with medium. You could drop all the way down to easy if you wanted, but because I'm working with fine silver here, this piece is made out of Phoenix torch fireable clay. It's a 999 fine silver. So the closest color match, I'm going to be just going down to medium. And this is a small bezel, you don't need tons of solder. So I'm starting off with 4 here, and I feel like that should be enough for me to pull around and do this full seam. If it's not, you can always pick solder and add some. But hopefully that'll be plenty. All right, so again, this bezel is much thinner and smaller, so I'm gonna be focusing my heat on this back plate and every once in a while heating the bezel itself. I think a natural instinct when people are just getting started with soldering is, this is where my solder is, this is where I'm gonna focus my heat. But especially on a piece like this where you're joining something very thin to something very thick, you're gonna end up melting your bezel. So since both pieces have to be the same temperature at the same time to successfully be soldered, I'm gonna really focus my heat on that bigger piece. Again, I'm heating the piece as a whole, and every once in a while kind of coming in on that bezel in the center there, and then going back out. And there it starts to go. That one chip just went. And then I'm going to come into the middle to draw it all the way through. And there it went. See, I actually had plenty of solder there. I probably could have gotten away with just one piece on either side. But at this point, that should be very securely connected, and it's ready for the pickle. The final method of soldering that I'm going to show you is pick soldering, and this method is most often used for closing jump rings or creating rings, and it is where, again, flux is applied to your seam. And then what you're going to do is you're going to heat this piece and then use a pick to pick up solder and place it, and it's going to flow right away. So since I'm joining end to an end, we're doing a butt joint. Pick soldering is a really quick and efficient option, especially if you're doing a bunch at one time. So I've heated this piece. I'm going to come over and pick up my solder. And then I'm just going to tap to place and flow. So again, that's a super quick and efficient way to be soldering a bunch of jump rings for a chain. These are the 3 methods that I use most often, and I hope that this video is going to help you get started in your soldering practice. Thanks for watching.